Guys, thank you to Barbell Apparel. Barbell Apparel supports me and this channel. They put out amazing gear. Get Bromley merch at the link below. Deadlifts have always been a massive pain in the ass for me, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself having inconsistent workouts. It's hard to predict jumps, and you might find yourself occasionally not being able to hit the numbers you want, not really understanding why the weight is just glued to the floor, and maybe on top of it, your back hurts, your joints are achy, and you're kind of pissed off. So I've got some tips to make deadlifting less of a pain in the ass. These are things that worked for me with my issues specifically, but also the clients that I've trained over the years. And a lot of them are tips I pulled off of some of the best deadlifters in the sport of strongman and powerlifting. Now, it's important to start off with some assumptions. How you program your deadlift depends on a lot of different variables. Very broadly, you're probably training your deadlift in one of two ways. The first way is the way a lot of powerlifters do nowadays, where they train with high frequency. They usually stick to the main movements or close variations. They don't really go hard on any one particular set, but it's a lot of skill-based work that they do repeatedly throughout the week. You can think of that as Olympic lifting applied to powerlifting. It's more deadlifting for skill and then making subtle changes in the program to drive progress over time. It is very effective and a much easier way to make your training a lot more consistent. However, it's also very monotonous and it's very complex. I usually don't recommend people do that unless they're working with a coach that specializes in that method of training. Most of us are in group 2. We don't recognize fatigue. We're juggernauts. When we go into the gym, it's to chew gum and kick ass and we're all out of gum. So if any part of your training has AMRAPs, if it has top sets or maxes, if there is routinely some amount of strain that represents the most you can do that day, you're in group B. The benefit of that is that effort and strain is very broadly a very effective and predictable driver of growth. However, in the short term, it can be very hard to navigate the buildup of fatigue, and that's what can make workouts very inconsistent. Now, if any of this describes your type of training, there's 3 big problems that we're likely to see that prevent people from continuing to make progress, and it usually has to do with recovery and efficiency. First problem people have is their torso. If you go to very hard repetitions at the end of a set, or as you start to add weight, you start to feel that you have a harder and harder time keeping your back straight. That is going to mess up your deadlift training. It's going to make sure that your reps are very inconsistent. It's going to hurt your confidence on reps. And it's also going to just pile on fatigue like a mother, because every single hard set you do is going to feature your erectors being put through a forced eccentric. Now imagine any other body part doing that and thinking how likely you are to be fresh a few days later for the other work that you're going to do. Probably not really, and you're probably going to have a lot of excess soreness and fatigue built up than you would want. So with the inconsistent pulling and with the huge buildup of fatigue, making it so that every good week, make sure that you're saddled with enough fatigue that next week is going to be a shit week, you can see why having those issues make it difficult to just progress a regular deadlift over time. The other problem that people tend to have is a weakness off the floor. Now, some people mistake torso issues with weakness off the floor. For a long time, I would kind of sandbag my starts because I was trying so hard to keep my back straight. I knew that if I gunned it, it would be a surefire way to let everything dump forward and ruin my entire pull. Now, weakness off the floor is a massive problem because the entire deadlift hinges on you breaking the weight off the floor, which is the hardest, most disadvantaged part of the entire movement. It's a part that requires the most amount of effort and drive and concentration. So slight deviations in your energy levels and your focus and your fatigue levels are going to make for huge deviations in whether or not you can even get through the workout. And this becomes very frustrating. In turn, this also affects confidence, gives you a complex around your pull. And this is where you get stuck trying to do 19 different things to set up so that you get that perfect break. It is not a good place to be in. The other problem people have are sloppy lockouts. This is typically the opposite of being weak off the floor. In fact, people that are really, really good deadlifters that have sloppy lockouts generally have a distinctively sloppy setup, and that's probably a big reason why they are having rough lockouts. Where somebody with a weak start off the floor spends so much time trying to get a perfect start, the person with the weak lockout doesn't really think about it. They're so strong off the floor that they just pull away, and usually they find the position they get into that allows the biggest, most explosive pull also sets them up for a really shitty lockout. Now, all of these problems add a level of inconsistency to your deadlifting that makes consistent progress difficult. They have their own recovery implications, where as you start to push the envelope, you tend to fall apart faster. And all of those things are going to be fixed with essentially the same principles. We want to use good exercises that provide very predictable carryover to your deadlift as a whole, while giving you a break from that continued accumulation of fatigue, while also targeting some of those weak areas that you can hopefully come back and start to set new PRs, because you are no longer restrained by this thing that was holding you back and screwing up all of your lifts and the entirety of your program. So in pursuit of fixing those problems, there's 4 different categories of exercises I want to talk about. We just have lists for days today. And these are going to do all the things we talked about. It's going to give you a break from the same stress, the same way that's running into the same problem. And it's going to have enough general carryover that it should make your deadlift better if you improve in these. And it should also be targeted. Now, all of these movements can be arranged a few different ways. You can use them as a substitute for your main lift to give you a break from that accumulation of fatigue, because any amount of novelty is going to be recovery. And some of these might actually make it so much easier for you that you can actually get a good run of linear progress, even if you're a more developed lifter. These are also all very effective as secondary and tertiary movements if you're looking at just a variation for the main barbell deadlift that you think is going to help out, or if you want to do deads on an alternate day without accumulating too much fatigue. And some of these are actually good isolation and secondary movements that basically count as GPP or hypertrophy work. So let's get into it. The first one is starting your deadlift at different heights. Deficits, rack pulls, mid shin, above the knee. Trap bar also counts. I love rack pulls for a whole bunch of reasons. One is because they're great for learning how to express strength in strong ranges of motion. This directly leads to overload. You're more advantaged the higher up the bar is, so you should be able to lift more weight through that position. However, most people can't or don't because they never train it. So unless they get the benefit of their drive off the ground, they find that starting at mid shin or above, they're actually very weak. You should be very strong. So it fixes that weakness. That in turn exposes you to more total load, which adds strength and size to your upper back, your midsection, and your hips. I also like it because I found, as kind of a disadvantaged puller with shorter arms, that full range deadlifts were very cumbersome, very difficult. So when I would drill those into the ground, I found that as I got strong, it became very difficult to do those on a regular basis without having very inconsistent performances, and that made progression almost impossible. It was super easy to swap in at certain periods rack pulls and have that be the center of my training for a little bit, that would give me a break while also providing some much needed overload that I wasn't getting because I was always limited by the weakest position, which was the bottom. I found that a 12 to 14 inch height kind of had me mimicking the position of some more advantaged elite pullers. Guys that are built with very long arms start in a more favorable position, and it explains why so many of them can pull for days without ever seeming to fall apart. So I found this is a very productive setup to clock a significant amount of work and even to hit the gas a bit more than I actually otherwise would with a full range deadlift. Trap bar specifically adds a benefit in that the bar is back closer to your hips because your shins aren't the thing keeping it out in front, and that increased leverage advantage actually makes it so that it's not so systemically strenuous. It affords you a bit of recovery, especially as you pull. You can shoot your hips through so much faster, and you find that the lockout is very, very easy. So it tends to be a bit harder at the start, bit easier on the top end, while also affording you generally more recovery than a stiff bar is going to. So alternating between the two or having trap bar on another day, I've heard that from a couple of people that use that as a way to clock more overall pulling frequency without getting chewed up by the straight bar. Remember guys, strength is positional. So wherever you are starting or initiating the movement, that is where you are going to develop the most amount of strength. The rest of the movement still does provide a stimulus at those positions. However, you're always training those positions with momentum on the bar. So unless you're actually practicing at some point breaking from a dead stop, you're never actually maximizing force development at those positions. Over a long deadlift career, it's very beneficial for you to practice developing strength at those different positions, if for no other reason than novelty for the sake of it. It will make you a more well-rounded deadlifter. The second category is emphasizing the start of the lift. And of course, you do this by training at different positions. So like deficit deadlifts is one way you do this. If you put a 2 or 4 inch, if you're crazy, deficit, you're going to find that as you get closer to your regular height, it almost feels like you're cheating. It almost feels like a rack pull. I know for me, when I was very bound, I always felt very insecure at the bottom because I couldn't get in a really strong position. And if you are inflexible, if you experience that at all, deficits are a good way to solve that. I felt so much more mobile and like I could really set myself in the position I needed to be rather than where my body was being forced into. Deficits also have an interesting way of solving the recovery problem, because even though technically a deficit is a harder movement, if you're not used to it, you get the benefit of pretty quick adaptation. And also starting out, usually you have to lighten the weight enough that there is kind of a systemic relief from not piling on the same weight that you're used to chasing. People usually are much quicker to keep the loads lighter rather than just redline it. So it can actually be used to kind of reset you if you are running into that wall week in, week out with your deadlifts from the floor. Also emphasizing the start is just spending more time. Things like bottom end partials or 1.5 reps or something that I've used that have been used by guys like Boris Shako that are very effective. And again, it's a way to break up the monotony. It's not stressing the same structures the exact same way. If more reps allows you to grease the groove and make your movement more efficient, it stands to reason that spending a lot of time perfecting just your start by not thinking about the whole lift is going to make it so that your start is very comfortable and that you've made a lot of adaptations around that position. Lastly, for emphasizing the start is starting from a disadvantaged position, not just a height, but setting your body up in a disadvantaged position. So this would be something like an RDL taken low, which I'm a huge fan of. I always talk about RDLs because it's more bodybuilder-ish than an actual deadlift. So you can actually cause a lot of strain, build up a lot of stress in your hammies, glutes, midsection, upper back without necessarily incurring the same absolute fatigue buildup. And it's really good for hypertrophy, but it also drills in the hinge pattern, which I really like. And it solves just a ton of problems. This is a lightweight solution to fixing problems with the start, the mid-range, and the lockout. Because each one of those movements, you're so disadvantaged from where you're typically set up in a full range deadlift with near maximal loads. And people are a lot more inclined to do RDLs for higher reps and lower reps, so that variability by itself probably gives some unique developmental juice where people have just been hammering away at the same weights for so long. But having your hips come all the way back, keeping your knees relatively stiff, and having to bend over more, that disadvantages the start quite a bit. Just with an RDL, you're so disadvantaged that you're not going to be using a lot of weight relative to your deadlift, so it's a little less specific. But that's why I like RDLs as a good second or third movement in deadlift workouts, because it is a little more bodybuilderish like that. Stiff legs can get a little bit heavier if you go all the way to the ground. And then there's snatch grip deadlifts, which are akin to a deficit, but you're going to feel a lot more of that through your torso and upper back, and it still makes the start very hard. This will help fix the lockout that's screwing up your recovery, but also all of those vicious technical inconsistencies that are giving you a complex and making it so that you can't actually progress because you're constantly fucking around with your start. You ever find yourself confused by the complexity of programming? I know I struggled like crazy in my early strongman career. There was just too much advice, and every decision I made felt like a guess. As soon as I hit a snag in any program, I would have no idea what to do, so I would inevitably bail. It took me years of training and coaching to figure out how to predictably increase muscle and strength, both in myself and others. And those lessons took me to my own showings in World's Strongest Man, America's Strongest Man, and the Arnold in the 231-pound weight class. This is why we made BaseStrength AI, to give clear, direct, and personalized instruction right in the middle of your workout in real time. BaseStrength AI features 3 programs: Block, 70s Powerlifter, and Bullmastiff, each one inspired by the work ethic and programming of the biggest and strongest bodybuilders, powerlifters, and strongmen throughout history. These templates originated in my book BaseStrength, and they can be ran as is, but with BaseStrength AI, weight and volume are prescribed to you on your specific feedback, and that's personalization that even an online coach can't replicate. This gives you the absolute certainty that every rep is meaningful, that every block of training is getting you closer to your goals. It's my programming, but it's your program. Get the heart of old school training with the intelligence of a coach right in your back pocket. Head now to basestrength.com. Now, away from emphasizing the start, you can emphasize the lockout. Now, overload is one of the biggest benefits here, handling weight that you've never otherwise handled. Remember, you're mechanically strongest at the top. Your potential for handling weight is so huge, and you're never going to realize it if you never train that away from being limited by your weakest position, which is always going to be somewhere around the start of the deadlift. It's as simple as adding bands to the bar and making it so the weight is light enough that you're starting with a good amount of speed and that you can build that momentum up into the top end to where, oh, holy shit, I have to really work to crank my hips out. So that does condition a very efficient lockout, and it forces you to approach it with speed. So you're committed to getting the hips out. You're not trying to coast to lockout. You're aggressively trying to get there as quick as possible because, oh shit, this sucks. This is really heavy. A lot of lockout issues do stem from your positioning. So things that challenge the lockout directly are going to make sure that you're not getting away with a lazy position. You're actually braced. You're getting the shoulders back. The hips are leading by shoving forward. You're mechanically doing everything you can as skillfully and as efficiently as you can, because that's the only way you're going to have the thing go off. Now, if you do have trouble with your lockout, make sure that the bands aren't just an insane amount of tension. Make sure that it's a reasonable amount of tension, maybe 30 to 50 pounds at the start. And as you get better, you can increase the tension more and more. Because bands take you out of the normal dynamic of having everything really heavy at the start in the mid-range and then kind of easier at the top, the start is now very easy. That contributes a ton of recovery to people if they've been in that cycle for so long. So even though you're straining at lockout, you might find that you're beat up kind of that day, maybe the next day, but your systemic recovery happens very quickly. That's something I've noticed with this lift. Also, I have to point out this hack. I pulled this from Travis Mash from an interview he did a while ago on Chris Duffin's podcast, but he talked about working up to a max with bands and then pulling the bands off and then working up to a max again with straight weight. Now, I haven't been specifically doing it with 1 rep maxes, but I'll get to kind of a heavy-ish 3 or 5 and then take, if I have 100 or 150 pounds of band tension at the top, I take that off, build up again. And what I find is that I am very thoroughly wrecked by the end of that. It feels like just about every inch of my system that contributes to the deadlift has been taxed. It starts out with my traps, upper back, and my hips coming through with that huge amount of band tension on those heavy sets. And then I find that the post-activation potentiation, I'm breaking weights off the start much faster, much more aggressively than I would be because my nervous system is primed and the weight doesn't feel heavy anymore. So there's a big psychological and neurological phenomenon to that. And that allows me to get more out of my actual straight weight workout, even though I'm a bit more fatigued. I've specifically been applying this to more elevated pulls to try to get really comfortable bracing bigger weights from advantage position, but I can see how this could work full range as well. Now, speaking of rack pulls and doing things from a higher position, whether or not you're using the bands, remember what I said, strength starts at the position. So if you're setting it mid shin, that's a position where all of the main movers are learning to express force and they're being strained to the greatest degree right there, moving from a dead stop. So the variety is good, but I also like that these set you at different torso angles. So going back to people that have issues bracing their torso, one of the easiest ways to work around that for recovery is to throw in the variety of different height deadlifts. Even a few inches makes enough of a difference that if you have trouble bracing, it will be a relief just to get a few extra inches of advantage on your next pulling session. If you are going for very high rack pulls, you're going to get a huge strength specific stimulus from that because if you're above the knee, knees aren't in the way. Now you can really load up the weight. So you have the potential to get really strong there and your hips might just get super powerful. But keep in mind, the more limited the range is, the less overall carryover you're going to get to the main lift. It's entirely possible to set like a 100-pound PR on like a mid thigh, like hand thigh lift or something, and actually lose ground on your full range if you haven't been doing anything full range. So that's important. Again, strength happens at positions. Now, you're not going to use this to replace your actual pulling, but as far as emphasizing lockout goes, anything that keeps your hips forward longer is going to have a huge impact. So supplementary work, I always preach loading and carries. The weight being in front of you, having to rock your hips through to get a few extra inches on like a keg or an Atlas stone or a sandbag over bar. You're going to feel that in your glutes and your hams like you never have as you're squeezing to get that last bit of extension. Also, the power pull is a good hack for this, as is the back attack. These are both two unique things. They're usually hard to get a hold of. Thankfully, I have both of them at Heavy Metal in San Antonio, where I'm training right now. but they have the unique quality of as you extend, the weight comes out in front. That's where it's the most disadvantaged. So that's where the hips have to work the hardest. And this is so easy to throw in either as GPP or on your squat day or a deadlift day, throw it in at the end, even as a warm up, just to get that patterning going. These both fry the extensors right at lockout like just about nothing else does. It's really kind of impressive. So I recommend those as supplementary work if you're having issues there. And any of you that are struggling with lockout, as you start to close the gap between your bottom end and top end strength, you're going to find you get more out of deadlifts from the floor. And it's a good way to reset that dynamic you have with your deadlifts where you're comfortable, but this style of pulling has made it very hard to progress any further. Then lastly, I would add a broad category of just varied and odd hip extensions. These are things that just build raw hip extension power. Everybody needs more of that. You could be the best, most skilled deadlifter in the world. If you have some exercise that's going to just increase raw power, all the better. So good mornings are probably one of the most popular. It's not exactly like a deadlift. You can do it a few different ways. The weight's on your back. However, if you suck it up, because so many people hate good mornings because they're uncomfortable, and if you get good at them, you're going to find that every bit of improvement has almost direct transfer, assuming you're doing some actual deadlifting throughout the week. Now, good mornings have the quality of being harder at the bottom. So as you bend forward, that's where the extensors have to work the hardest to get you going up. So that lends itself to the erector and hip power that you need to start big deadlifts. So developmentally, if you hammer good mornings, a lot of sets and reps, you put some meat on those areas. Yes, of course, your extension is going to be a lot better at the start. But this is one of the reasons I did like the back attack and the power pull, because it flips out on its head. And it's nice to be able to go through a full range of motion and really feel that opposite effect where it's harder at the top. However, good mornings, you can add bands to them very easily. Don't go crazy, but if you add bands to good mornings, you can smooth out the strength curve, and they turn into such a devastatingly effective both hypertrophy, kind of general develop movement, but also specific, just nasty hip extension power developer. And then, of course, there's the strongman movements, ones I preach to everybody that nobody does, and I've already said them here. Kegs, stones, bag loads, anything where the weight is in front of you is going to keep you under tension longer in a way that you're not going to get on a barbell. And if you're extending, it is the upper back working to keep everything in, along with supporting the weight via your erectors and midsection, and all of the muscles through the glutes and hamstrings trying their damnedest, because even 300 pounds, if you're a 600-pound deadlifter, feels like 600 pounds when you're trying to maneuver and get it up and over a bar. And this has the capacity, again, to just develop a nasty general amount of extension ability that you're not going to find anywhere else. And I mentioned this stuff too because it's also viable for assisting your deadlift if you're actually not doing a lot of deads. Specific carryover requires that skill, but general development is super easy to do. If you are focused on, let's say you're squatting or you're taking a break from deads for whatever reason, hammering the stuff is not only fun, but if you do hammer squats and you stay up on this stuff, even though you're not really deadlifting from the ground, if you have a good squat run and you make market improvements on these types of events and you increase your amount of volume, the amount of effort you can put out, you'll be amazed. Many times, people in strongman will do something like that and then come back and be like, oh my God, this contest prep, there was no deadlifting, but I just did a shit ton of loading and carries and so on. And I came back, my deadlift feels very good. That's not going to take you from like a 750 to an 800 deadlift, but if you are in the 400 or 500 range, if you're in that kind of middle, I'm just starting to get strong deadlift range, this stuff can just come up from behind and surprise you. You can widen your base out in a way that you really did not anticipate. And the recovery, it's not the same as really heavy deads in the way it beats you down. You feel fatigued. It conditions a lot of different energy systems and uses a lot of muscles, but it's not so systemically draining that you get the same fatigue buildup that we're trying to prevent here. So that's it, guys. These are my deadlift problems that face everybody, that throw everybody off. These are my favorite exercises for straightening you out. If you're going to replace your main movement, I recommend something that is somewhat full range of motion, probably at least 13 inches off the ground. And you can absolutely throw in variations and supplementary work as you see fit in order to solve the problems that you're having. I don't recommend alternating every week. I'm not a fan of that. If you're having trouble with the deadlift on a progression week after week, you can move to one of these exercises as your main lift, run it for 3 to 6 weeks, enough that you see some improvement in it and that you get a break from the beatdown of deadlifting over and over and over, and then consider transitioning to something else or maybe back to pulling from the floor. You always want to conceptualize your training in blocks. Don't get in the habit of just winging it day in, day out, because that gets frustrating and it leads to a lot of no progress very fast. So that's all I got for today, guys. Thanks so much for watching. Till next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.